All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for welcoming me to your local meetup. I live in Mountain View, but I've been doing some work near Davis since the beginning of the year, so I'm driving up here every week and on Monday nights and then leaving Tuesdays. So here I am before I drive back. Well, maybe I'll stay in town tonight. Depends on how much beer I drink, I guess. My name's Erik Bryn. I'm on the Ember.js core team. I'm here to talk about Glimmer. Out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of Glimmer so far? Have any idea of it? Okay, so very few. How many of you have heard of Ember? Okay, almost everybody. That's great. I like that brand recognition. How many of you have used Ember or are using Ember currently? All right, that's about right. How many of you are using React right now? All right, whoa, okay. How about Angular? Okay, interesting. All right. You were using Angular before Angular 2, I understand. That's me. I run a company called Prototypal. We are the experts in Ember. We do consulting and training work. I'm really lucky. I got involved in Ember at the very beginning of its life in open source, and I've been able to make my living off of it. So I kind of got to turn my like side project and hobby into my job. So I guess I'm a success story in that regard. And business has been pretty good. You can find me on the Twitters and GitHubs at Bryn. Yeah, I'm on the core team. I'm less active in the development of Ember. I'm an emeritus member, which means that I get all the benefits of being on the core team, but I don't have to do any work, which is quite nice. Glimmer used to just be Ember's rendering engine. So you might have heard of HTML bars. Glimmer was renamed, HTML bars was renamed to be Glimmer back in Ember 1.13. This was probably like, I don't even know, 2-3 years ago. Time's a blur. So we basically, it was around the time that React came out and React got popular, and we were more pressured about the performance characteristics of Ember, so we put a bunch of work into refactoring the internals of the Ember view layer and turned it into something a little more React-like, used some of their ideas, and made Glimmer. It also included a bunch of awesome improvements to our templating system, which has a heritage in handlebars. So we introduced a second version of Glimmer back at EmberConf 2 years ago now, and that was released in Ember 2.10. The thing that's cool about Glimmer is that we completely rewrote the internals and made Ember like multiple times faster than it was, but it was a drop-in replacement for everybody that used Ember. So if you installed and upgraded the latest version of Ember, your app just got like twice as fast for free. So that's kind of a story that I will try to come back to, but the thing about, if there's any takeaway, if you don't know much about Ember, you should know that if you don't like having to constantly upgrade and like change your code when you're writing JavaScript applications, Ember is your best friend because we follow Semver and we have 1.0 already, so you can be confident that if you write an Ember app today, in 5 years from now, you'll have an upgrade story, or it will still work when you actually open it up and try to make changes to it. So Semver is very hard, and that's why you don't see that in the JavaScript community. You see a lot of churn. You see the treadmill of JavaScript, and you probably feel it day to day. But we don't believe in that in the Ember community. We want to build software that makes our lives better and easier and not feel like an endless treadmill of upgrades. So it's worth it for our users to do this work. So we've been significantly improving app performance, and with Glimmer 2, we actually ended up to eke out more and more performance out of our rendering system. We actually started taking more and more of what made Ember Ember and pushed it into the view layer and into this library that was highly optimized to do the things that Ember apps needed to do. And so it actually became feasible at that point that we could release it as a standalone thing. And so the chatter started kind of happening on the core team, like maybe we should go, actually try to compete what I would consider downstream, like in the React and just the view layer areas. So brace yourselves, a new JavaScript framework's coming. Now, hopefully that's not the takeaway that you have, but it was a good joke. So Glimmer.js, not to be confused with just Glimmer 1 or Glimmer 2, but Glimmer.js is actually that standalone library, and we just announced it back in March at EmberConf. So you can check out Glimmer.js.com if you haven't. It's pretty popular on Hacker News. I thought it did pretty well. I was happy with the release. So the problem with bringing Glimmer to the masses as a standalone library is that Glimmer didn't actually have everything that you needed to have a productive development experience. We actually needed to add a bunch of stuff in. So Glimmer 2 does not equal Glimmer.js. Glimmer 2 plus a bunch of supporting code and glue code and whatnot, plus Ember CLI, gives you Glimmer.js, basically. So we extracted the essentials that you would need in a component library from Ember, not just code-wise, but actually like in spirit. And so, you know, we've officially contributed to this problem. Hopefully you've all seen this one, how standards proliferate. So, no, again, this is a joke. We actually have an interesting story to tell with Glimmer, and you know, basically here's a taste for some of the essential things that we had to either extract from Ember specifically in code or in spirit to get Glimmer to be useful on its own. So development tools, Ember CLI. You'll see that in action in my demo. I'm going to actually attempt to do some live coding. We'll see. Dependency injection and container system. If you don't know what that is, it's kind of useful. So you might want to look into it if you're doing JavaScript development. Conventional file layout. So, you know, one of the things we try to do with Ember is we try to make your skills extremely portable across projects. So the more the framework has an opinion and the more that it can do, conventions over configuration wise, the easier it is for you to jump to any other project and be immediately productive on day one. You don't have to like read and figure out like what build system they used, what all the glue code was that tied, which versions of which dependencies they're using. If you've used Ember in one project, you can use Ember in any project and you feel like you're at home. And that conventional file layout is a huge part of that. You just know where to look without even having to think about it. And our object, we extracted some important things that gives reactivity on top of the ES6 plus object class system. So the thing that's also really important about Glimmer is it helps us as Ember experiment before things get into Ember themselves. And this has been a little bit problematic for us. Because we have these SEMVer guarantees, we don't want to break people's apps. It's kind of hard to experiment and kind of do rethinks about certain pieces within that context. So it's kind of nice to have a playground where we don't have to worry. We can experiment. We can kind of more easily experiment as well because we're not perhaps fighting the framework as much as you might think. So some of the things that we're doing in the Glimmer ecosystem that will almost certainly filter up through the into the Ember ecosystem are what we call angle bracket components. So this is basically just means you can use web component syntax in Ember. Right now you're limited to only using handlebar syntax to invoke components. That's coming soon to Ember. The module unification RFC, this is basically a file layout thing, how you lay out files and how you can co-locate components with other components that are relevant to it. This is mostly about like how you can get automatic JavaScript bundling. So if you like bundle things by the routes that they're used in, the system can automatically give you bundles per route. And also it's easier to know where code is and like what the dependency of this code might be. So like I'm only using a component in one route. I can actually put that component in a directory that is for that route rather than it being in some global directory that every component's in or something, but it's harder for me to understand the relationship between the components and the application's hierarchy or organization. So we've got a new dependency injection system that's a little more bare metal and fast. And we're working on auto tracking in Glimmer, which basically means if you've looked at Ember's computed properties before, you have to actually define what the dependent keys are. We're going to have automatic dependency tracking. We call it auto tracking right now. So that's what Glimmer is kind of bringing to Ember. And ultimately, though, what's the vision here? I've been making jokes about like, oh, yeah, here's another JavaScript framework, right? That's not at all the true of our strategy with Glimmer. So our vision is really that you can start with Glimmer and you can npm install your way to Ember, right? So this is probably what you're used to if you're like a React user. You start with just the Vue library. You can make a component, and then you're like, oh, I need a router because I have like multiple pages in my application. Then you install React Router. Well, the same story will soon be true of Ember as well. So this is important for a few different things. I think primarily the thing that I hear over and over and over again is when people are trying to learn Ember, they're intimidated by basically the standard library that Ember gives you. It's harder for them to wrap their heads around where the lines are in APIs and like where the Ember's router begins versus where the component layer is, and what, understanding the lines between them. They are well fractured, but when you try to learn Ember, it just looks like it's one big monolith. But it's actually not the case. And so it turns out, rather than keep trying to argue with people and say Ember is not a monolith, we're just going to actually split it up, and the Glimmer effort is basically the first stake in the ground for that. So kind of the second vision is that you should be able to take Glimmer components that you've written, and you should be able to drop them into any existing web application. And that started kind of the thing we've been marketing that as for the Ember community is you can take a Glimmer component, you can put it in your Ember app. But actually, it's not just that. It's also you can put it in any web application. And basically, this is the thing that excites me the most about Glimmer. And that's because Glimmer can go where Ember hasn't been able to. And if you're familiar with Ember, if you've ever used it, you've probably felt this pain of how do I bring Ember into my organization, because Ember is a single page application framework. It has a router. It wants to kind of own the whole code base in a way. It's hard to just like wedge it into an existing app. A lot of people have existing applications. We can't just go rewrite them all, right? Well, and so this is basically why, I would say if you asked anybody that's been around the JavaScript ecosystem for a long time, they'd probably say like, Ember is good. It's been around forever. You can trust that they're going to deliver on the things that they say, but it's always number 3, right? It's always like Angular and Backbone used to be our competition back in the day when I started using it. And now it's like React and Angular, or maybe Vue.js, but like basically Ember's always like the 3rd best. And there's a reason for that. It's because we can't go everywhere that Angular can go, that React can go, and that Vue can go. And that's because we've consciously focused on building the best experience for building single-page applications. So if you're not building a single-page application, you probably can't use Ember, or you can. It turns out you could use it, but our documentation, we don't really advertise towards that. It's not our target market. And so that has been a conscious decision that has limited the kinds of projects that Ember will be used for. It's going to primarily be used for greenfield projects by a highly skilled JavaScript team that understands all the benefits that Ember's giving you out of the box. They've probably done some amount of backbone development in the past and felt the pain of the big ball of mud that they've ended up creating. And they're like, no thanks, we'd rather just have a standard way of doing that. Teams that have 10 people, those people can much more easily collaborate on an Ember code base than likely any other technology that's out there. Sans maybe Angular 2/4 now, because Angular's kind of come more to the Ember side of, kind of monolithic framework in a way, if you want to use the negative way that it's viewed. So it's been an interesting few years for me because I've been doing this since like 2011, and we've gone through, I've seen all the crazes now. I remember when Gwt was big. I used XJS. I skipped Knockout. I did a little bit of Backbone, but around the Knockout and Backbone era is when Ember was created, and so I hopped on that bandwagon, and I've been on it ever since. But Angular was huge, right? Angular 1x, and then React comes out and eats everybody's lunch. So the problem, right, is that not everybody can build a single-page application. More people can build Glimmer components, though, right? And you'll see why that is when I get into the demos. And so what that means is more people can share the infrastructure that exists in the Ember community, and we can get more bang for our buck. We spend a ton of effort building up all the supporting technology that Ember is built on top of. But the problem is we're number 3. We have the smaller market share compared to React and Angular. And we're doing a disproportionate amount of work to create all this stuff to not have it be used by as large of amount of people. And that can be frustrating, especially when people are asking, like, why don't you just use Webpack? Well, Webpack isn't actually good enough to use in Ember right now. We have different primitives. We have better build time performance than Webpack does with Ember CLI. So the problem was also Webpack didn't exist when we created Ember CLI. But it doesn't actually make sense to just switch it. Those are the kinds of things you won't hear from the people making those kinds of assertions. So the more people using the infrastructure that we've built, the better it will get. And that is a big, exciting thing for me. So also, Glimmer is super easy to learn. I actually teared up a little bit when I read this because the opposite has been true of Ember probably for its whole existence. Glimmer is super lightweight. You can learn it in 5 minutes. And so I was like, oh my God. If I have to hear about how steep the Ember learning curve is one more time, this is like the complete polar opposite of that. So it actually gave me a lot of joy to read that. So obviously, more people are going to want to learn Ember if they can use Glimmer in their applications. This is a good thing for the general Ember ecosystem. And hopefully, because actually Ember makes building single-page applications so much darn easier than you're probably experiencing out there today, more people will hopefully get on the single-page application bandwagon. And they're going to end up using Ember probably if we can succeed with this vision of starting small with Glimmer and being able to npm install your way up. So, so React is so hot right now. Although I'm surprised more of you didn't raise your hands when I asked who was using React. But what if I told you Ember can also React? So not just Ember, but I stared at that for an hour today. That was my motivation. That's what got me ready to give this talk. So why Glimmer over React? Why should I care, basically? Well, Glimmer is a superset of HTML and web components. So this is kind of a good metaphor, I think, is how if you care about your CSS preprocessors, you might have liked the fact, you might like Sass over less, because Sass is a superset of CSS. It doesn't really get in your way of using HTML. The same is true of Glimmer, right? So if you're tired of HTML4 or class names, Glimmer is just standard HTML. You can do all the nice things that you can do in React, except it's HTML. So if you have designers or you have more junior people that you don't want to explain the difference of HTML attributes versus properties to, then you can just use Glimmer and it works as you would expect. So, it's not. The React community loves to try to put everything in JavaScript. Glimmer isn't quite that. It tries to be a good building block on top of the existing web standards technologies that everybody knows. So I think Glimmer can go places that React can't. That means things where you're actually taking in user input in HTML, perhaps, or you have more novice type users wanting to, maybe you want to build a blog like the new WordPress or the new Drupal or whatever. You can actually let users type in HTML tags, right? Because they probably know a little bit of HTML, and those things can be backed by Glimmer components or Glimmer or web components built with Glimmer. And they don't have to learn that class names is a thing or HTML4 is a thing on labels. So, and hopefully more people know HTML, right? You're basically just using the technology that's already bulletproof that everybody uses. So. Another cool thing, as I've been alluding to, is Glimmer easily exports to web components. I'll try to show a demo of this. Time, depending on how much time this takes. But it's actually really, really simple. You basically just say install an extra plugin, and when you run your build via Ember CLI, it gives you a JavaScript asset that you can include in a page, and then you can just use the HTML tag that you built with the same name as the Glimmer component. So this kind of lets you use the platform, if you've been hearing that marketing message out of Google lately. Another thing is kind of shifting over to like a little bit more of a technical side of the Glimmer engine, is if you know what should component update is, and you've written a bunch of those to get performance out of your React application, the easy kind of one-liner is that you get that for free in Glimmer, because it's not a virtual DOM implementation. It's actually something a little more sophisticated than that. So this is a great blog post written by Yehuda Katz, who is the creator of Ember, co-creator of Ember, and also spent a lot of the time baking the Glimmer architecture over the years. So I can't wait for the abstraction of virtual DOM. So I think Glimmer isn't, like I said, a virtual DOM. It's actually a virtual machine. And this isn't a talk to talk about the deep technical details of the Glimmer VM. But like I said, this blog post is quite good. Let me just explain why that matters. So virtual DOM is like a hot buzzword. It turns out that virtual DOM is not actually the holy grail for performance. If you look at initial render times here, you can see that we are actually faster than React at rendering initially. The only thing that's faster is Inferno. I'm not quite sure. Nobody probably has heard of it. It's some like very esoteric, I think it might be a virtual DOM implementation, or maybe they're doing something interesting with it. But basically, Glimmer is faster than Preact, which is also kind of the new hotness. I guess I should have asked who's using Preact. Maybe you switched from React to Preact. Yeah, we're faster than React at first render, right? So if you care about the speed of the app booting up, Glimmer's faster. It's also smaller in file size, if you care about that too. Like a Glimmer application is actually smaller than React itself. So if you build a very simple Glimmer application, you'll have smaller file size than React, the library, without your code. And more importantly, this is where we smoke everybody, is re-rendering speed. So Glimmer is not a virtual DOM. It's more intelligent than that. It understands the relationship between the data and the output, the DOM output. So it can tell when data is static, when it will never change. It can tell, rather than building, a very simple way of explaining this is when you build a virtual DOM, you're actually still building up a tree of all the DOM nodes that may never change. And so when you need to do their reconciliation algorithm, and you need to actually determine what has changed between one version of a virtual DOM and another, you have to traverse that whole tree and do comparisons across the whole tree. Glimmer builds up a tree that is only of the dynamic parts. And because we use templates, we can actually see here is where HTML is. We don't need to worry about the HTML at all. We don't build that as part of our re-render tree. And so this is how you end up with significant performance gains in re-rendering. And re-rendering means basically any time data changes after initial render, right? So that could mean clicking around and changing routes in the application. It could mean just updating text, right, from a form being edited or something. So this is where our Glimmer VM architecture smokes the competition, basically. So Glimmer does not mean the death of Ember, as hopefully I've made clear. If you want to read about that from another member of the core team, you can check out this blog post. Hopefully, actually, if we succeed with this vision of npm installing your way to Ember, the lines will actually be very blurry, right? Because if you're using Glimmer and you're like, how do I, like, am I using Ember? The answer to that question will probably mean if your package.json file has some package with like Ember prefixed on it. Because really, Glimmer is just the component library, but if you want a router, you're probably going to npm install Ember router. And so at that point, you're kind of using Ember, you know? So the lines are going to be blurry. So if anything, like I said, hopefully what this means is that it's going to actually increase Ember adoption significantly, assuming that we can get people to use Glimmer, which is why I'm here. So, so why might you care about Ember over React? Well, one does not simply write apps with React, right? How many other dependencies do you bring in? How much third-party code? You know, the story for kind of the high-level abstractions for React are still in flux. Redux seems to be the big winner, I guess, but that's for now. You might know React Router, or you might have used to know React Router. It's on version, is it 4 or 5 now? So I like to troll React a little bit because they're kind of the front runner. It used to be Angular, but I'm friends with the React guy is like, it's all in good fun. So hopefully you're not too offended if you're a React user. So why might you, I had to throw this in because I realized I was kind of like not ignoring Angular, unfortunately, for them, like most of the JavaScript ecosystem lately. But why might you care about Ember over Angular? Well, like I said before, the stability without stagnation story is really heart of this. So Ember's 1.0 to 2.0, we deprecated a bunch of stuff. It might have been painful for you if you were using a lot of that deprecated stuff. But if you had an Ember 1.13 app, which was the last version of Ember 1x, and you removed all the deprecation warnings that were spit out in your console when you're in development mode, you could upgrade to 2.0. That's all it took, right? We didn't boil the ocean or completely change. Our infrastructure and our architecture was solid enough that we could remove the cruft that we, over the years, many years, in the 1x series, we determined like, hey, there's a better way of doing this, or we want to get rid of this code because maybe the JavaScript ecosystem has a solution for it that we don't need to include in Ember itself. We also got an add-on ecosystem in this whole period of time, so like it was a lot easier to install third-party plugins instead of the code having to be in the framework itself. So 1.0 to 2.0 was just a matter of like getting rid of some of the old crufty stuff, and actually people wrote add-ons that like polyfilled it, and so you could actually jump from 1 to 2 relatively easy. That is in sharp contrast with Angular 1x and 2x. So I think that's all I need to say. Also, where is 3.0? Where is 3.0? I want to know. I thought this is also like a fun JavaScript ecosystem thread on Hacker News. It's like, is this relevant anymore? It's probably, you guys probably can't read this. Most of the JavaScript developers are working with Ember. Ember, I thought that died after React came out. React, I thought that died after Vue.js came out. Vue.js, I thought that died when Angular 4 came out. Angular 4, I thought that died when Scala.js came out. Anyways. So the story is, oh yeah, jQuery's dead, by the way. The story that I'm trying to tell here is you can start small with Glimmer, and you can build big with Ember. Now, this is a story that we're telling that's a little premature, because we just announced Glimmer, and it's still in, this vision is still in the process of being built. But hopefully, by the time you start your next project, you'll have the opportunity to take a look at Glimmer and give it a try. So again, that's the vision. npm install your way to Ember from Glimmer. How many of you love JSX? All right, I can appreciate that. So I asked on Twitter, what is your favorite thing about JSX? And Pete, see, I'm friends with Pete. He helped me out. The trolling opportunities are the favorite thing about JSX. That's kind of true for me. Yo, dog. I'm all in good fun. So why Glimmer for JSX fans? Well, people love to say JSX is just JavaScript. I will give them that. Glimmer, if you assert that, then you must assert that Glimmer is just HTML. It's a superset, but it's HTML, and that actually has a lot of value. So you can actually do single file components in Ember and in Glimmer. If you're interested in exploring that, ping me and I'll show you the path forward. It's not like a super documented path, but if you ever look at how you write component integration tests for Ember, you'll see how you can use the library for that to build single file components and put your template code inside of the same file as your JavaScript. So that's possible in Ember. I would say the one thing that's kind of annoying is Glimmer is based off of, it has a heritage in handlebars. And so, control flow logic is not quite as nice. It's, being able to write an if statement in JavaScript is kind of nice, although you probably could imagine all the bad things that people will do with having all of the JavaScript syntax inside of their render functions. So Glimmer is it's much more restrictive. It tries to still keep that ethos of logicless templates. But there have been quite a bit of advancements if you haven't been paying attention or used Ember lately. If you want to be able to do things like have if statements that can check equality without having to create a computed property, that exists in Ember now. If you cared about else if statements. That exists in Ember's version of handlebars. It doesn't, I don't remember how much of this exists in handlebars itself nowadays, but Ember's version of handlebars, which we call Glimmer, is a lot more sophisticated than you might have seen previously. So take another look. The debugging story is still not as good as I would like, but we do actually have some debugging handlebars helpers. So you can log data from inside of a template. You can also set a breakpoint. So with that said, let's do a demo. How am I doing on time? OK, great. I talk fast. All right, so let's see. How do computers work? Let's try mirroring. This is not the best place for me to try to code from, but I will do my best. And OK, cool. I'm going to have probably less screen real estate. Should I make the font bigger? I'll do it. All right. So I was just making sure that so I did this because I wasn't sure how bad the internet might be. But basically, up here at the top, you can see we're using an Ember command. This is provided by Ember CLI, which is, if you're familiar with like the Angular CLI or the React Create app, this is like the OG boss CLI that everybody's copied. In fact, Angular's CLI is Ember CLI. They just search and replaced Ember with Angular. I'm not joking. It actually is that. In fact, they even like overwrote the standard output device to actually substitute Ember and Angular at one point in time, because they like kept getting output from the CLI that said Ember in it instead of Angular. I'm not joking. That is actually serious. Ember CLI is great. If you're somebody who likes to build their own build tools, then maybe it's not for you. But for people that are interested in like just getting off the ground and being productive from the first minute they sit down, and just being able to focus on building an app instead of configuring the build system for your app, Ember CLI, it beats the competition. The other cool thing about Ember CLI while I'm talking about it is the add-ons. So we have add-ons, but add-ons are really just NPM packages that follow a special interface. And that special interface allows the add-ons that you install to configure the build environment automatically. So if you've used Webpack and you've had to like do plugin configuration in Webpack, that does not exist in Ember. Ember CLI is a zero configuration build tool. You install Ember CLI SaaS, and you can just start using SCSS files. You install, whatever the plugin is that exists in the Ember ecosystem. While I'm at it, I'll just show you. You can go to emberaddons.com, or you can go to emberobserver.com, and you can peruse our many add-ons. So I might want, what's something that people use? What's a third-party plugin or something that you use? I'm curious. Lodash? All right, so Lodash. Ember Lodash, great. You can actually copy the install command here directly. This is a little wrapper library. So I'm not actually, if I paste in here, you'll see Ember install Ember Lodash. This is a thin wrapper on top of npm install. It does -- save dev for you. And it also it gives the opportunity for the npm package to perhaps copy files that might be like boilerplate configuration, if it happens to require configuration, into the project that you're installing it into. So you don't need to like look at the documentation. You'll actually see, I don't know if this is going to ruin my demo. OK. It probably doesn't work because I'm not in the directory of the actual app. But you'll see it goes and installs it. And then if it needed to do anything, it has the opportunity to do that. Ember CLI gives it a hook. And now you're ready to run off to the races. You don't even have to look at documentation most of the time you use these things. So it's pretty cool. Hopefully that doesn't ruin my live demo. So basically, to get started with Glimmer, you can use the Ember new command. This is Ember CLI, like I said. You give it the name of the project. And this -b option, one of the cool things that Ember CLI has as well is a blueprint system. And so when it actually is pluggable, you can create add-ons. So Glimmer/blueprint here is an npm package that tells Ember CLI how to generate the new application. So if you have like a bunch of boilerplate to build an application in your organization, you can put that in one place, and then you just tell people the install command to run, and they'll get your existing blueprinted application that might have your deployment configuration, whatever. This is the kind of stuff we have in the Ember ecosystem. It's quite nice. By the way, if I want to deploy an Ember application, I just install Ember CLI deploy and run Ember deploy with perhaps a S3 or GitHub plugin, and you will be deploying within seconds. So unfortunately, I don't have as much time to pitch the Ember ecosystem. I'm focused on Glimmer. So, but that's just some teasers. So here we are in our Hello Glimmer app. I'm just going to preemptively remove that Lodash thing because I don't want to add any variability into my live demo and embarrass myself. So first off, right off the bat, so we've created the new Glimmer application using Ember CLI. We run Ember S or Ember serve, or if you want to look at all the commands you can do, you can run Ember test, or I'm sorry, Ember help. You'll see there's a whole bunch of commands you can run here. Ember install, Ember new, Ember init. There's a whole bunch of good stuff here. The important piece, actually, that I'll point out is Ember generate. So if you don't know how to like create a new thing, a new object in the Glimmer or Ember ecosystem, you can just run Ember generate. You could actually say Ember help generate, and it will tell you all the things you can create. And you just run Ember generate that thing. Now, what's going to be relevant to us here inside of our Glimmer application is you'll see we can generate Glimmer help, Glimmer components and Glimmer helpers. So let's start with our first component. Well, actually, let's open this up in a text editor so we can see what's going on, assuming it will open. All right, I have a bunch of junk open. All right, so here's our Glimmer application. The important bits, there's a bunch of like boilerplate configuration type stuff that comes for free. Like we have the concept of environments built into Ember CLI applications. So if you like want to minify in production, it automatically does that for you. If you want to change the minification settings, you can just go do that in the config environment file. So the important piece here to kind of get us started is, well, there's a index.html file, and this will get served automatically if we just boot up our development server. So Ember CLI comes with a development server, works with Glimmer and Ember apps. It gives you live reload out of the box. So you don't have to do any configuration. You're just off and productive immediately. So let's go ahead and go to localhost 4200. And here's kind of the boilerplate Glimmer app. So let's take a peek at what's going on here by starting in the index.html. So inside the index.html, basically, there's nothing except the kind of boilerplate HTML page. The key pieces here are a style sheet link tag, style sheet link tag, right, and a script tag for including the JavaScript of the Glimmer application. It has like this root URL stuff is like you configure it if you like put the app on like a nested folder path. The build system can do the appropriate things that it might need to prefix your paths and CSS and all this kind of stuff automatically for you. So we've got this components folder, and we've got a component that by convention has the same name as the application we generated. So this is the like root level component, right? This is the component that will get automatically rendered when you boot up the application. So you can kind of imagine, well, I can actually show you where that's done. It's nothing fancy, but if you're familiar with React, there's the React equivalent in Glimmer. So the fact that it's rendering the Hello Glimmer component by default is just this string. So you can change it if you wanted. All right, so let's take a peek at this components template. So nothing too special here, right? It's just some basic HTML. Let's take a look at this component.ts file. Now, by default right now, Glimmer generates TypeScript based JavaScript files. You can actually just use normal JavaScript. You can change the extension right now. It's a little buggy because it was kind of built TypeScript first, but there's no requirements to using TypeScript in Glimmer. So if you want to use it, then right now it happens to be the default, but I would suspect in a matter of weeks, if you try to do this again and you run Ember generate, you'll get a JavaScript file instead of a TypeScript file. So here you can see that we get a simple class definition that's empty. This is nice and new ES6 syntax. And we are extending the component class that comes from the Glimmer component library. So let's do something basic and simple to get started. So Our component is going to have state, right? There's going to be some properties that we want to store on it. So how do we do that? We can say simply name equals Erik. So this is our first property. This is using the class properties syntax, which is pretty cool, that TypeScript gives you today, and that's coming to future versions of JavaScript very soon. So this is basically the equivalent of writing a constructor and saying this.name equals Erik. So this is obviously a lot more succinct, which is nice. And these don't get put in the prototype, if you know what that means. This is actually instance properties. So you can also do this with objects and arrays, and it just works like you would expect it to in any other classical inheritance language. So it's kind of nice. So we've got a name property now inside of our component, and let's use that here. So it's as simple as just saying, welcome to Glimmer, and the familiar handlebar syntax you might have seen, or mustache syntax. So fingers crossed, I go back to the browser. I didn't have to hit refresh because the live reload plugin that comes by default in Ember CLI just automatically refreshed for us. All right. So if I maybe try to do this on the side here and go over here, I can say SacJS and boom, right? So, so that's a basic like component state, rendering in our template. Okay, no big deal. So let's generate another component that we can invoke inside of this component. So I should have split earlier. So I'll open up another terminal window. And inside of here, I'll run Ember.js, which is short for generate. And I'll say, I'm going to generate a component, a Glimmer component, to be specific, called foo-bar. So inside of this component now, you'll see we have a new, inside of our project, we have a new folder, right, foo-bar. It automatically created our component file and our template file. And so inside of here, we can say, hello from foo-bar, right? And ideally, we should be able to render the foo-bar component from our root component, the hello Glimmer component. And so that's as simple as just saying foo-bar, and we can use self-closing tags, something you can't do with web components, but you can do inside of Glimmer templates, which is kind of nice. So this is like BR or image, if you know those things. So we can see that, as you would expect, we can create a component, render it inside of other components very easily. Now, the thing that I want to make sure to point out here tonight is being able to pass arguments into a component so that you can see how that works. So there's a little bit of special syntax for passing arguments that are accessible by the Glimmer component in JavaScript space. And so you can use @ as prefixing the attribute that you're passing to this HTML tag. And you can say, name. So we're passing the name property that exists in our Hello Glimmer component. We're passing it down because maybe this component wants to do something with that data, right? So, of course, if now we go over to our template, you might expect, OK, well, maybe now we can use name. Well, actually, Glimmer treats variables that are passed in differently than variables that are state inside the component. So if you're using React, you probably know the difference between props and state. It's the similar thing here. And so you actually are explicit. You use the @ still. And that means it was an argument that was passed in. So if all goes well and I save everything and go back to the browser, you can see we've got the name passed down. Great, no big deal. You can access these properties that you pass in are special. You can access them inside of the JavaScript implementation. I should also point out, so like the thing that's really cool that is probably different than what you are expecting from if you're a React user is that if I want to just say like class equals foo, and I want to add that class to this HTML tag, I've done everything I needed to do now. These HTML tags we're not doing anything to override any of the existing. When I said it was a superset of HTML, right, I meant it. These at properties are kind of the superset piece, and that's where the Glimmer functionality comes in. Anything else that you put onto this tag will automatically end up in the root element of the components tag. So when you're invoking a component, you don't need to create new parameters for HTML attributes that then you need to actually associate with the underlying component's HTML element. You just get a nice, obvious kind of behavior for free with Glimmer. And this is pretty nice. So to switch back over to these Glimmer arguments, component arguments, inside of our foobar component, we might want to do something with this name, right? So we might want to use this name and like concatenate it with other things, right, to have some kind of view-specific derived value that comes from that name. And so we could do something like, you know, get. We can use just plain old getters in Glimmer. So you can say like full name. I'm just making stuff up here, but I could actually say, okay, you know what? Full name is going to be a concatenation using fancy new syntax here. And the way you access the arguments passed in is with the args property. So if you're used to props, args is props in Glimmer. And so I can say args, this.args name. Now let's go switch our component to use my first name again. Save it. And hopefully, oh, I never used the full name property. So I created this new full name property that is kind of like, it's derived state, right? It's like state that's specific to this component that came and was derived from this argument. So ideally now, we can actually reference not at name and not at full name, but full name, because it's state of this component now that is derived from the argument. And so hopefully, boom, right? So now we've taken input. You can imagine this being a multitude of things, right? And you do something different with it. So you can use getters to do this. Now, the thing that will get interesting is that let's say data is you want your components to be reactive. Data might be changing over time, and you want your components to react to those changes. So like, let's do something kind of silly here. But I'm going to implement a constructor, and I'm going to call super before it yells at me even more. What is it complaining about? Do not match. Oh, so I need to pass the arguments, I think, here. All right. I don't know why it's complaining. I think it'll just work. All right. Actually, I think I know what it is. Yay. OK, cool. So sorry I didn't prepare for this part of the demo before. So we're going to do a set timeout to react to like emulate. Maybe the server comes back with new data. We're using WebSockets, whatever the thing might be, right? So in 2 seconds after rendering our main component, we're going to actually swap out the name to something else, right? And so let's do. Is there? Oh, thanks, Siri. All right.
Looks like you're trying to set a timeout.
So I'll Clippy, yeah. So I'm going to change it to my dad's name, which is John. All right, and in 2 seconds. Right now, let's see what happens. Nothing. Interesting. Let's open the console. So Glimmer differentiates between properties that are static and don't change and properties that are reactive. And this is actually a performance thing, right? Now, this is not necessarily how it will probably, this is not how Ember works today. It's probably not how Ember will work in the future. But in Glimmer, we're trying to build the fastest view layer that you could ask for, right? And basically, we actually get a little bit of savings by treating properties that we know are not going to change differently. They're static versus properties that are dynamic. So when you're outputting these properties, we know that we don't ever have to care about those properties changing. And we can, like I said before, when we're building up our DOM tree, we actually don't include those as part of our virtual DOM, if you want to use that terminology. So in order to do this, we have to opt in. And the way we opt in is we use a decorator called tracked. And so I'm going to bring in tracked here as another argument from our component library. And all I got to do now is just say this property is tracked by saying @tracked in front of it. This is a decorator. This is a standard JavaScript feature coming soon, but it's accessible and usable in TypeScript right now, which is great. So now, hopefully, now I've marked that as tracked, we'll see that, fingers crossed. Ah, great. So John changed, but Erik didn't. Why is that? Well, remember, we had a derived version of this. So we, just by setting tracked at the top level, components level, right, it doesn't mean that anything that's using that, consuming that value, is also tracking it. So this is, again, the same kind of fix. Right? So, OK, we don't want full name to just be a one-time computed value. We want it to track its values. And now this is kind of interesting. So we can say tracked, and let's see. Hopefully my, oh. Let's see. Ah, something's wrong. I think I know what it is. I think this is a bug. I should have practiced this in the demo. Let's just try something real quick here. I added this in live. Big mistake. All right. So let's see. I'm just going to try copying this value over real quick just to see if that makes a difference. Actually, you know what I should use? OK. Tracked name. All right. Let's, hopefully this saves my demo. Otherwise, I will admit defeat. Yay. OK, cool. So there's a little bug right now with tracking args, I think, in the version of Glimmer that I have installed, which is a little behind. So anyways, that gives you kind of an idea for the reactivity. Again, this is opt-in, so it might feel a little more verbose than you would prefer. But this is something that, you know, is a trade-off, basically. It's like if you want mega speed, then do the least amount of work that you have to and require some level of opt-in or declaration of the user's intent. But you could very well imagine that we have, so this is like the Glimmer component subclass. So we are getting the component from Glimmer component. You could actually imagine that we have a different base class, right? And that base class could automatically track all the arguments and whatnot that's passed in. And that is more user-friendly, perhaps. And that's probably what Ember will do itself. But if you want to like drop down and use the low-level component that is super, super fast, you can choose to do that. And that's a thing that's pretty compelling about the Glimmer experience is basically, you know, right now it's fast by default. But fast by default isn't always the most ergonomic thing. So you can kind of choose, like, I don't really care about shaving milliseconds. I'm willing to let Glimmer or, you know, some other, or Ember auto-track my things for me. And you can do that by default. And then if you're like, oh, you know what, I need those milliseconds because I'm rendering this component 1,000 times, you can drop down to the tracked syntax and get the speed bump that might provide you. So assuming like not all the properties are tracked on the component, right? There might be a subset, and that would give you a speed boost. So let's see. How am I doing on time? Pretty close. So check out Glimmer.js.com. We've got a little short guide. It is something I think you could go through in 5 minutes. Glimmer. There you go. You also can watch this nice video with Tom's face. He's like one of the co-creators of Ember. You can go through the guides and API docs. And if you've looked at Ember's guides and API docs, you will notice these are much smaller because there's a lot less surface area to Glimmer. So if you were intimidated by Ember, or even if you're intimidated by any of the existing view layers that are out there, I hope that you take a look at Glimmer and see how much simpler and how much easier things could be. And you might be able to sell it to your team. Now, let's jump back to my slides real quick. So there's a couple things like, you know, you might care about the router because, let's see, where did my other, there you go. So Glimmer is very basic. It's just like React right now. We're not fully to that vision of being able to npm install your way to Ember, but that's going to be starting to roll out. So if you pay attention to the Glimmer and Ember ecosystems, you'll see this kind of progression happen. But if you wanted to do routing in a Glimmer application right now, you can actually take one of the packages that Ember's router is built on top of. It's called the Route Recognizer, and it recognizes URLs and dispatches them, kind of like a switch statement, to the appropriate code that should handle it. And this is a demo app using that, written in Glimmer, done by somebody on the Ember core team. So here's some gotchas, right? Like, if it wasn't clear, Glimmer is pretty alpha right now. There's no Semver guarantees. I don't think like large amounts of it are going to change because, as you can tell, it's pretty minimal. But that's an important note. If you're an Ember user, you have pretty high expectations for Semver. Those aren't the same guarantees we have in Glimmerland right now. Server-side rendering does not exist right now for Glimmer. It exists for Ember. If you haven't heard of Ember CLI fast boot, if you've ever tried to, who has ever done server-rendered JavaScript like React or anything? Has anybody actually managed to do it? What if I told you that you just Ember installed Ember CLI fast boot and you could then deploy to Heroku and it just worked? That's kind of the story for server-side rendering in Ember. We're going to bring that same story to Glimmer. We're not quite there yet, time constrained. Also, the testing infrastructure in Ember is first class, but we haven't had a chance to adapt it yet to Glimmer. That's going to come soon. And the other thing to note, and I kind of have mentioned this, like, just because something exists in Glimmer, it's not a signal that it's definitely going to be in Ember. We're, again, using this kind of as experimental ground. So if you're also kind of a JavaScript hipster like me and you like to get into the nitty-gritty and try to find new patterns or whatever, Glimmer is another playground that you might like, just like the React ecosystem. And you can kind of be in at the ground floor of that and help eventually probably influence Ember, because we're going to be using this as experimental ground. And if we like the ideas and we think they're solid, then we will actually bake them into Ember. And so that's going to be exciting for people that might have been using Ember, but they're like, man, the React ecosystem's hype. That's exciting. That's hopefully what we're going to be bringing to Glimmer as well. So here's a terribly named project, but pretty cool. It's actually asteroids written in Glimmer. So if you're looking for some code examples, you can go ahead and play this, and you can also look at the code. It's actually pretty nice. And I was told like a month ago that this so this is like something that people have implemented in a few different JavaScript frameworks. The Glimmer implementation, I believe, was 30% smaller than any of the other implementations. It might actually, no, you know what? No, it was the React one specifically. 30% smaller than the React one. So anyways, there's also to-do MVC example. So this is like kind of ridiculous in 2017. But if you want to look at to-do MVC, feel free. And that's all, folks. So thank you very much. Do I have time for some questions? One or two? No, I want hard ones, but that I can be really long-winded with. Okay, all right. Any questions right off the bat? No? Yeah? What's up?
How is Glimmer and Ember related?
Glimmer is a part of Ember
No, but I mean, like,
that we
how
remove.
is Glimmer a pun of Ember?
It's not a pun at all. No, I don't know where the name came from. I'll have to ask now that I think about it. I don't remember. I think we were just like looking for a good name that had something to do with like fast UIs or speed. It's just, it's a glimmer in your eye. I don't know. Yeah?
Can Glimmer handle like SVG?
Absolutely. That's a very big sales point that we have that is actually pretty unique in the JavaScript ecosystem. If you love building data visualizations with D3, D3 and Glimmer are a match made in heaven because Glimmer is 100% SVG compatible. So, and Ember has been for a long time too. In fact, I've done a lot of work with companies like Netflix in data visualization space with Ember and hopefully Glimmer in the near future. Other question? Yes?
Do you have any kind of automatic template selection, like depending on what browser it is or if it's mobile or something?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Glimmer, not yet, but if you're interested in the Ember space, there is a project called Flexi. It actually does more than just that. I think they might have extracted it because it was kind of a plugin that did several things. But one of the things it did was give you, like, basically in your components folder, you could actually have like a mobile version, a desktop version, a tablet version, and you can, in a configuration file, set your breakpoints or whatever you want, and then it would automatically choose the appropriate template depending on the breakpoint that the user had. Yeah. Anything else? All right, well, thanks again, everybody. Don't be a stranger. I'll be around.